Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengraber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Tracy Jeanne Rosenthal?
Hi, it's me.
Hello, Jean. It's Paul Holdengraber calling you. I'm so happy that you're able to take my call and that you're part of the Quarantine Tapes. How are you today?
Yep, I'm good. I'm good. It's not raining in Los Angeles anymore, so I have that to be grateful for.
And what are you doing these days? And how are you spending your own quarantine?
Mostly, I've been spending it, as I am sure a lot of people are, on Zoom. Particularly for me, it's with the Los Angeles Tenants Union. We've seen our membership double in the last few weeks, and that has been both really exhilarating and also really trying, as we're, trying to relearn all of the skills that we built in public space and holding meetings together in person and import all of that to an online environment.
It's amazing the kind of adaptation we are all going through now. I imagine it must be exhilarating and exhausting, as you say. Could you tell us a little bit for our listeners what the LA Tenants Union is and the kind of work you do?
Of course, yeah. So the Los Angeles Tenants Union was started about 5 years ago. It's a group of tenants that work to expand tenants' rights. We're not a nonprofit. We're an all-volunteer effort, and we are funded through membership dues. We take on the structure of a union, and our mission has always been to fight for housing justice and against the forces of gentrification and displacement that turn our cities into places for investors to extract wealth rather than for humans to live and thrive. And so through our history, we organize at the building scale by organizing tenants associations, so groups of individual tenants in the same building or who share a landlord will form a tenants association. And then we organize through local chapters. There are now 12 local chapters of the Los Angeles Tenants Union throughout the city. And then at the scale of the city, we have the union. So we've always been, we're a horizontal organization. And we're, in fact, we're not an organization, we're a movement.
Right.
And we are building we think of ourselves as building the infrastructure for a movement for tenants to realize that they are not alone and that together they have power.
In an essay, which is a kind of a manifesto called 101 Notes on the LA Tenants Union, you write in one of the entries, you write, "When we call this crisis a housing crisis, it benefits the people who design housing, who build housing, who profit from housing, not the people who live in it. It encourages us to think in abstractions, in numbers, in interchangeable units, and not about people or about power. We don't have a housing crisis. We have a tenants' rights crisis." find that very powerful, and I'd love you to unpack what your statement there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that oftentimes the way that this problem is framed is in terms of these, when we think about housing, what do you picture? You picture buildings, you picture
Right.
apartments. We often use this abstract word unit, which I think is disgusting and needs to be eliminated from our vocabulary. Because what housing is, it provides people with their relationships to their communities. It provides them with their relationships to themselves. It provides them with their relationships to their histories. And so I think it's really important for us when we look at when for us to reframe the notion of this crisis and who the protagonist of that crisis is. The protagonist isn't the arbitrary structures in which we reside. It's us.
Right.
It's the people that, make those places what they are. And so I think, this has been in the Tenants Union, part of our work is to reframe the protagonist of this crisis. And I think when we do that, we are led to very different solutions for, what is often called solving the housing crisis. And we're looking at very different people who are going to be the architects, to use them, or the agents of that effort.
How did you, I detect absolutely no passion on your part. How did you get into this business?
I mean, this is actually funny because I think it's very important for me to say that I am deeply replaceable in the sense that if the Los Angeles Tenants Union is to continue as it has and as it will, that I need to be replaceable. So there's nothing special about me. There's only, and actually, if I become a bottleneck of any kind of expertise or information, then that actually prevents the union from functioning. So, I mean, we think about, in the Tenants Union, we think very differently about the idea of leadership because we recognize it as service. So I am providing a service to the union by speaking publicly about our work, by taking interviews, by normalizing our demands with the language that with the whatever flourishes of language I can muster. But then, and of course I can say that on a personal note, that I find especially in this time of isolation, I find myself so grateful to participate in a group. And I often have in the past, and I only experience that more now. It's funny, I was reflecting at Passover. My last name's Rosenthal. I feel like it's obvious.
Yes,
I had a Zoom Passover with my family, and I was remembering that in the Maxwell House Haggadah, which is the Haggadah that we used growing up, there's this line about the wicked child who asks the question, "What did God do for you?" And the way that the way that I remember this so vividly, the way that it was phrased when you tell the story is, by saying for you and not for us, that child is absenting himself from the group. And had he been there, he would not have been redeemed. And I think that there is for me, this right now we are being faced with the unraveling of American individualism and being asked to act collectively. And I think for me that call, I think that runs very deep for me, but I also think that it is not unique. I think we have been called and will continue to be called to do that work. We had been before and will be long after this crisis.
Tracy, nevertheless, you marvelously avoided my question in the most magnificent way. What yeah, what triggered your passion to fight for this movement, as it were, even if you are replaceable? I'm curious. Was there a moment? Was there something that made Tracy Jeanne Rosenthal say, "This is my vocation"?
I mean, I think for me, it was as a lot of as the most important experiences I've had have been in connection with others. So I was part of a group called School of Echoes that began 7 years ago. And to be honest, I was really there because I happened to wake up at the space where this meeting was going to take place. And I went to the first meeting. And as it turns out, this group was founded by some of the founders of ACT UP LA, the founders of Union de Vecinos, which is a group that's been advocating against the demolition of public housing and for the residents of Boyle Heights for about 30 years. And that collective was a very loose and generous process, but I think that was the process in which the Los Angeles Tenants Union was founded. We as a collective decided, what were some things that we had in common. We all happen to live in neighborhoods undergoing a process often euphemized as change, right? So we wanted to figure out what is gentrification, but then we didn't want to just analyze gentrification. We wanted to stop it. So right. I became a part. It really, I mean, again, it was a decision that I made in connection with a group of people. And I think for me, and I can also say that one of the most radicalizing moments was realizing that right now it's 65% of all wealth is held in real estate and 75% of that is in housing. So when we look at the source of inequality, the access point of the financialization and of the exploitation of space that is producing the inequality that we see, it is happening in housing. So part of it was, this radicalization process, that if I can call it that I went through with a group of people. And part of it was it was the Easter. So, right, come to Jesus moment about where organizing can take place that will actually fundamentally reorient the distribution of wealth that exists at this moment.
And it's a complicated issue, I imagine, now, because what you're talking about, and I think to some extent it's a very Jewish way of looking at the world, which is that things are done within a community with others. And now, of course, we are at a distance from each other. We can't be in touch with each other, but nevertheless, in order to organize, we need to have contact in some form or another. So we have it through the medium of Zoom meetings and such, which I'm sure changes the nature of what it means to organize and to create an awareness among people who usually would be working together, perhaps in the same room. Who are the people with the power now to make substantive decisions about tenants' rights in Los Angeles?
Oh wow, there was so much in what you just said that I want to respond to too, right?
Respond to all of it.
I mean, yeah, I absolutely. I mean, it's just been so fascinating to watch. The Tenants Union operates under the principle of language justice, so all our meetings are held simultaneously in English and in Spanish, and so we had to figure out how to reproduce that online, because we know that the majority of people in Los Angeles don't speak English at home. And so thinking about the immense creativity that has gone into reimagining what organizing can look like online has been like, yeah, absolutely incredible. And then also just thinking about what you said, in terms of this moment of isolation, I mean, it's really fascinating because at the same time that we're experiencing this isolation, we're also experiencing the generalizing of a kind of precarity that has been experienced in Los Angeles for years. So like 600,000 people in Los Angeles pay 90% of their income in rent. So they are, it's absurd that people have been making this choice between food and rent, medication and rent for months and months before, and years before the crisis. And, we say in the Tenants Union, there's always been a housing crisis for poor and working people. And I think it's really interesting that this moment has actually led, even in its, through necessitating isolation, it's generalized these conditions of precarity that actually make us more connected than ever. And I mean, I often say organizing is the alchemy that turns shared vulnerability into shared power. And that is what we're doing. So if you ask me, right, like the last question was, who is capable of making the decisions that affect tenants in LA? Yes. I think there are two answers to that question. There's the answer of Mayor Garcetti, our mayor, our governor, Gavin Newsom, our city council people who get paid $200,000 a year and can't figure out how to hold a Zoom meeting. But I think that I think that what we're witnessing right now too is that what's becoming more and more obvious as both the mayor and the city council stalled on basic protections like eviction moratorium, right, which would allow tenants to follow their orders, follow government orders to stay inside. One of the things that has now been made even more clear is that the majority of LA city council people, even though the majority of its constituents are renters, the majority of city council people are landlords. The California Apartment Association is one of the main, they spend the most money in lobbying in the state government. And we know that Eric Garcetti himself has ties to so many development deals. So I think we are both seeing who our decision makers are, and we are also seeing the result of their conflict of interest. And then at the same time, the Tenants Union exists because we don't trust the so-called beneficence of our representatives. We don't feel like we can wait for them, and we never have. So we've always organized on the principle of building the movement and building associations, building the local and building the union for the sake of using tactics that bring those people to the negotiating table rather than ask them to do what is right. And so those tactics, I think right now you can see like the decision-making power is also with the tenants of Los Angeles and what they're willing to risk and what they're willing to put in to organizing at this time. So, I know that sometimes it's, I think to really to really believe in the empowerment of tenants, I also have to believe in their responsibility.
There seems to be a real correlation between tenant protection and homelessness. And how does the work of the LA Tenants Union relate to activism around homelessness? Because the current policies seem like a recipe for the vast expansion of our homeless population when eviction becomes legal again in a few months. And how,
Absolutely.
and it's frightening to realize. On the one hand, Newsom, gave people the impression that they have 2 months where they don't have to pay rent, but when those 2 months expire, as it were, they will have to, and many of those people will also have medical conditions which will make them even more vulnerable. So, just thinking about these issues is so daunting, and I'm wondering what you're thinking, and if there are any proposals or solutions that you might imagine could be feasible.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important that the LA Tenants Union refers itself to it as a tenants union. We define tenants as anyone who doesn't control their own housing. So for us, that includes renters, who are normally thought of as, the protagonists of like tenant protections and renter struggles. But for us, it also includes people living outside, people who are incarcerated or detained by ICE, right. People who are, and even right now, thinking about bank tenants, people whose housing is actually owned by the bank, and they live in their housing at the behest of a bank. And yes, I completely agree that if we have an eviction moratorium and that is the only protection offered to tenants at this time, then what we will see is the accrual throughout this process of tenant debt, which would be more than any tenant emerging into an economic recession could ever catch up on. Like, if we recognize, and I think this is the time when the solutions have to take into account the crisis that tenants were already experiencing. So for us in the Los Angeles Tenants Union, nothing less than total rent forgiveness will do, because nothing less than total rent forgiveness will allow tenants to emerge, we will allow tenants to emerge and retain their housing.
But Tracy,
and at the
But Tracy, what I was going to say also, to play devil's advocate a little bit maybe, let's say that there is a landlord who has units, right? Who has 3 or 4 units, a horrible term, and he or she rely on those 3 or 4 rentals to pay their own bills. If one thinks of forgiveness in that context, it probably will make it very complicated for those landlords whose survival depends also on those sometimes small incomes they may get from their properties.
Yes. And I mean, I think, there's one mode in which I want to declare, congratulations to all landlords for just discovering that their income depends on somebody somewhere having to work. But at this moment, I think it's important that we remember that the quote unquote mom and pop landlords makes up less than a third of who owns housing right now. But I think that it is important in those instances. We can pair mortgage forgiveness and rent forgiveness. And we have to remember that the first congressional bailout went not to people, but to banks.
Right.
And if we, as both mortgage holders and leaseholders, want to see any of that bailout benefit us, then we are going to have to force the bank's hand. And so I think at this moment, the Tenants Union is also wanting to organize small landlords and thinking about how landlords themselves can advocate for mortgage forgiveness that would benefit both them and their tenants. And I think that we can realize that there is an interest in working not separately, but together. And then just to go back to the question of homelessness, I think the other thing that we are advocating really strongly in the Tenants Union right now is that there should be no vacancies in this crisis. That the idea that there are hotel rooms sitting empty and Airbnbs sitting empty and all of these luxury buildings that have been vacant for the time up in that are now vacant, that these need to be used for emergency housing for houseless people and immediately. And this is a demand that we're seeing emerge both in the city, in the state, and also across the country, that these vacancies need to be put to use.
Just reading about what's happening in Las Vegas, for instance, is so disheartening and so difficult. And I don't want to keep you much longer also because we're running out of time and I want you to get back to work because you have a lot of very important work to do. I want to leave you with a quotation that matters to me greatly and have you comment on it. I had occasion some years ago, just before she died, to speak to Ursula Le Guin, who said the following. She said, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine rights of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." I'm wondering how that might resonate with you. I could imagine a little bit.
It's amazing that you pulled that quote. In fact, I actually use it. I wrote another essay about the state of Los Angeles organizing, where I begin with that. And I think that for me, it really speaks to the way in which we have normalized our own disempowerment. And it is up to us to empower ourselves to change the conditions in which we live. And I think that this idea, again, that, you know, these structures that we think are outside of us are actually us. They're made out of the decisions that we make every day. And that's not to say that, I mean, this isn't the model of, you know, you can buy recycled paper towels out of capitalism. This is saying, like, what if we reorient ourselves to the collective in a way of reimagining what our collective efforts might produce. And I love that quotation. I think maybe I'm a bit stunned to hear it now, and I'm very pleased. And I hope I could ever do it justice.
Well, it sounds like your work speaks is kind of a footnote to that quotation. So I'm really pleased to speak to you, and when we no longer need to distance ourselves socially or otherwise, I hope to meet you, Tracy, and it's been really a pleasure speaking with you, and I wish you all success in bringing a little bit more fairness into this world. And I'm thinking that maybe one of the effects of this pandemic is that it might make people realize that there is another way of living, that there is another way of interacting, and maybe there is even a shard of hope somewhere.
Yeah, I believe that too. I'm going to look out my window and just continue to believe that so we can keep doing the work. And I guess I'll just say that, it was lovely to talk to you. And for anyone who heard this and wants to get involved, we have all of the social media channels, and we would be more than grateful for you to come and help work with us.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And
thank you.
And all the very best to you, and happy Passover, even though it's past.
Yeah, I know. Only a few more days of no bread, thank God.
That's right. All the best to you. Thank you so much for taking my call.
Of course. Have a great day.
Take good care. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.